Tulsi Gabbard was supposed to be here, but ended up Skyping in, saying she got called back to D.C.
In a few hours here later today, we're going to be voting on legislation invoking the War Powers Act. This has to do with the act of war that Trump took against Iran, illegally and unconstitutionally, putting our country into a state of war against Iran without any declaration or authorization from Congress. Now, this is action that Congress should have taken beforehand. I've introduced legislation like the No More Presidential Wars Act, introduced provisions in the big defense bills to ensure that this or any president comes to Congress before beginning a new war as the Constitution provides.
As the only 2020 presidential candidate to have served in Iraq, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard has made no secret of her desire to end U.S. military involvement in the Middle East. When she was asked earlier this week about the prospect of war with Iran, she reminded us all why she is against escalating the conflict.
We hear a lot of politicians speaking with toughness and bluster on television about what we have to do. The vast majority of them have no idea what it means to serve in harm's way, nor do they understand what these moms and dads and husbands and wives and children are going through as their loved one is called up.
Joining me now is Democratic presidential candidate and Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. She served 2 tours in the Middle East, is a major in the Army National Guard, and a member of the Armed Services Committee. Congresswoman, thank you very much for joining us. You were in that briefing yesterday. Did you come away with any evidence that justified the killing of Qasem Soleimani?
No. And I walked into that briefing looking for the evidence and the information that this administration has been touting, but joined many of my colleagues walking out feeling very frustrated that no such information was presented. There were very few questions that were even answered, and not in a way that shed any real light on why this administration felt justified to throw our country headlong into a war with Iran. I left that briefing feeling confirmed in what I felt would be true all along, which is that this is an unconstitutional and illegal act of war by this president. So the question of whether we will go to war with Iran is irrelevant. We are at war with Iran, and the real question is, will we allow it to escalate, and if so, for how long and at what cost? So my hope is that with what we are doing here today in Congress, that we are taking action to do our best to try to bring about an end to this war before it's allowed to escalate any further.
Let me ask you this. The president today, in speaking to reporters when he was holding another event, suggested that Qasem Soleimani was plotting to bomb an embassy. Let's play that.
We caught a total monster, and we took him out, and that should have happened a long time ago. We did it because they were looking to blow up our embassy. We also did it for other reasons that were very obvious.
Do you know what he's talking about?
There was no evidence presented yesterday in that briefing suggesting what the president is saying there. And the point that he's making, that we went and we took out a really bad guy, I don't think anyone's disputing that fact. The problem with that is that our commander-in-chief should not be making decisions based on who's a bad guy or who even may have blood on their hands. Our commander-in-chief has the responsibility to make these serious decisions based on what is in the best interest of our national security, what's in the best interest of the American people. And the decision this president made actually undermines our national security, placing our troops and our country at greater risk.
Wasn't it an assassination? And if so, do you think that's a war crime?
It was an assassination. I'm not an international law attorney, so I'll leave that to the experts to assess. But it was absolutely an illegal and unconstitutional act of war. Congress should have acted long ago to prevent this administration from being able to further abuse those constitutional powers, taking that responsibility away from Congress. I introduced provisions both last year, or in 2018, as well as 2019, to prohibit this administration from acting against Iran militarily without congressional authorization, unfortunately, those provisions were ultimately stripped out of legislation that was finally passed.
Let me ask you this. The New York Times is reporting that Gina Haspel didn't take a position on whether to kill Soleimani, according to those who were in the briefing, one of the briefings that she gave before this happened. But the officials, according to the Times, who listened to her analysis, came away with the clear view that the CIA believes that killing him would improve, not weaken, security in the Middle East. What's your response to that?
Again, the takeaway from the briefing yesterday that I had was a recitation of the many different wrongdoings of Soleimani and his Quds forces over the many, many years, but very little to absolutely no real concrete evidence that taking out Soleimani would prevent any immediate targeted attacks, nor would it increase or improve our national security. The exact opposite is true, and that's evident in two ways. Number one, Iran is speeding quickly towards developing a nuclear weapons capability. They are no longer complying with the Iran nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. And number two, it's because of this escalation that our forces in Iraq, who are supposed to be trying to prevent a resurgence of ISIS and al-Qaeda, are no longer able to do that, because now they've got to focus all of their efforts on defending against Iranian forces and Iranian-backed militia, allowing ISIS and al-Qaeda really an open door to reconstitute themselves and pose once again a greater threat.
If you were in charge, what would your policy in the Middle East be? How many troops would you leave, if any at all? And how would you deal with what is now an escalating crisis with Iran? Tensions are escalating.
Tensions are dangerously escalating. Given the situation of where we are today, I would remove our troops from Iraq and Syria specifically because of what I mentioned. Number one, they've got no clear, achievable mission that they are there to accomplish that serves our national security interests. And number two, the longer they are there, the more likely it is that they are at risk, and we find ourselves in this quagmire of a war with Iran that nobody really knows what they're trying to do. What needs to happen now, and if I were president today, I would work to de-escalate tensions, get the United States and Iran back into the Iran nuclear agreement to prevent them from continuing to enrich uranium and develop their nuclear weapons capability, remove these crippling sanctions that are really a modern-day siege, a tactic of war, and work towards actually working out the differences that we have with Iran on a parallel track, the issues that have been brought up with regards to the expiration dates in the nuclear deal, their missile capability, and other issues. We've got to choose diplomacy and prevent an escalation of this war.
Let me ask you this. If we did pull our troops out, and we did pull our troops out of Iraq, and that left a vacuum for ISIS to constitute and threaten much of the region and the West, what do you say to those who say pulling out is just going to allow another terror organization to fill that void?
Well, our troops are there right now. This administration is deploying more and more, thousands more of our troops to the region, and specifically to Iraq. And those actions are strengthening ISIS and al-Qaeda and unnecessarily putting our troops in harm's way. And they're not going there to prevent this resurgence of ISIS and al-Qaeda. That's the real national security threat that we have. That's why I'm saying we should pull our troops out of Iraq and Syria. If there is a growing threat, we can have troops go in and fulfill that very specific achievable mission of defeating that threat and getting back out. But the current existing policy of administration is essentially holding our troops hostage with a policy that is strengthening ISIS and al-Qaeda, and it's strengthening Iran's threats and capabilities.
Just one more question. What is your red line? When should the U.S. get involved?
Look, if there is a direct, imminent and direct threat against American forces and American interests, then that is where the assessment of intelligence and that decision has to be made. But here's the issue with that is, and why I'm so hesitant to even talk about red lines is, the Constitution has to be respected. And we've been hearing this thing about, well, imminent attack, imminent attack. Well, this administration has completely ignored Congress, citing Article 2 of the Constitution, yet failing to provide any evidence as such.
Contender Tulsi Gabbard is taking digs at failed presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. The Hawaii congresswoman telling Tucker Carlson why she thinks Hillary lost in 2016.
I think everybody knows and understands that she is a warmonger. Her track record is well known, and I think this is why a lot of people back in 2016 in the general election decided that they would vote for Trump because of what he was saying on the campaign trail about ending stupid wars and bringing our troops home.
All right, Gabbard's comments come after the hashtag I voted for Hillary Clinton went viral on Twitter. Social media users suggested if she were in office, there would be no conflict with Iran.
Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, she's a major in the Army National Guard. She deployed to Iraq in 2005. Congresswoman, so good to see you. Thanks for joining us. As someone who served in Iraq, what was your reaction on an emotional level, if you would, when you heard missiles were targeting bases where Americans are serving, bases you're familiar with?
A lot of my friends serve there. It was last night in New Hampshire. I was literally just walking in the door about to kick off our town hall meeting when my staff started passing me notes and tweets and the reports that this attack was happening, and it just brought back like a flood of memories of what we were going through on a daily basis, the camp where we were, which is LSA Anaconda at that time, but really highlighting we are in a state of war now, and immediately thinking, okay, where are our troops? What are they doing? Are they safe? Thinking of their loved ones back home, highlighting the seriousness of what's really going on there. Well, thank God no one got hurt.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. What do you make of where we are, how we got here? I could see we've heard Trump supporters and President Trump basically say, look, no American casualties, and we took out a bad guy, Soleimani, a terrorist leader. What would your response to that be?
Well, first, I just came from the intelligence briefing that the administration came and brought to Congress. Really, they provided vague comments, no justification whatsoever for this illegal and unconstitutional act of war that President Trump took.
You don't buy the imminent attack against Americans?
No, they failed to provide any compelling information to prove their point of imminence. And really, it brings us to the central question here, which is our country's national security better off because of Donald Trump's actions and decisions? The answer to that is no, in two primary ways. Number one is Iran is now in a position where they're not really abiding by any restrictions from the Iran nuclear agreement. They're continuing to escalate in speed towards developing their own nuclear weapons capabilities, creating a greater threat for us, to our allies and partners, and to the world. And secondly, because the troops that we have in Iraq now and the additional ones that this administration is sending there are no longer focused on what their mission there really has been, which is to prevent a resurgence of ISIS and al-Qaeda. The announcement from the commander that came from there that said, we're not doing that anymore because now we have to shift all of our efforts and focus in a defensive posture against Iran and Iranian-backed Shia militia. This leaves the door wide open for ISIS and al-Qaeda to start to reconstitute and to start to be able to build a resurgence in their terrorist activities.
What do you make of the argument made by Secretary of Defense Esper and others, which is like, look, Soleimani and the Iranian and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they've been attacking Americans for decades, and it's not a secret. You don't need intelligence on this. They killed an American contractor at the end of December.
If this administration wants to go to war with Iran, they need to come to Congress, because Congress is the only body that has the authority, based on our Constitution, to decide whether or not to go to war with Iran or not. That has not happened. And that just shows the shallowness of the argument that the Trump administration is making, where on the one hand they're saying it's because of an imminent threat, but on the other hand they're saying, well, look at all of these things that have been happening for a long time. Once again, it comes back to this core question that our commander-in-chief must be able to answer, which is acting not in a reaction to say, well, we got to go take out a bad guy here or a bad guy there, but what is in the best interest of the national security of our country? What is in the best interest of our safety and security as Americans? And I think Trump's actions and decisions here further highlight his lack of experience and understanding at a basic level, and lack of foresight in national security and foreign policy, unnecessarily putting the American people further at risk.